We think of prison as a place for criminals, thieves, murderers, people who break the law in a violent or public way. But for centuries, one of the most common reasons to be locked up had nothing to do with crime. It had to do with money, or rather, a lack of it. This was the world of the debtor's prison. It was surprisingly easy to end up there. Life in the medieval and early modern period was precarious. You didn't need to be a grand merchant who lost a fleet of ships at sea. You could be a simple baker, a farmer, or a craftsman. A single bad harvest could ruin you. If you were a farmer, your crops might fail. You couldn't pay your rent to the landowner. Now you were in debt. If you were a baker, the price of flour might spike. You couldn't afford to buy it, but you still had to pay for your shop. Now you were in debt. Sometimes debt came from a single, unfortunate event. Your horse, essential for your work as a carter, could die. You'd have to buy a new one on credit. If you couldn't make the payments, the lender would come for you. Or maybe you were brought to court for a minor dispute and lost. You were ordered to pay a fine and court costs. If you didn't have the cash, that fine became a debt, and that debt could land you in prison. The legal process was terrifyingly simple. It wasn't about proving guilt, it was about proving a debt existed. Your creditor, the person you owed money to, would go to a court. They would present a contract, a note, or simply bring witnesses to swear that you owed them money. The court wasn't there to judge if you were a bad person. It wasn't there to figure out why you couldn't pay. Its only job was to confirm the debt. Once the debt was confirmed by the court, the creditor had power over you. They could get a writ, a legal document that allowed for your arrest. A bailiff or a sheriff's man would come to your home or your workshop. They would take you away. It was a civil matter, not a criminal one. This is a key difference. You weren't being punished by the state for a crime against society. You were being confined at the request of a private individual. The entire purpose of the prison was not to punish you, but to squeeze the money out of you. The logic seemed straightforward to the people of the time. If a person owed money, they were probably hiding it. Locking them up, taking away their freedom and comfort, would surely motivate them to reveal their hidden assets. Or, if they truly had no money, it would pressure their family and friends to pay the debt for them. The prison was a tool of coercion. It was a holding pen designed to make life so miserable that someone, anyone, would find the money to settle the account. This meant the prison sentence was indefinite. There was no doing your time. You weren't sentenced to 6 months or a year. You were sentenced to stay there until the debt was paid. If the debt was never paid, you could die there. Your creditor held the key to your cell. Only they could agree to your release. The state was just providing the cage. And so, people from all walks of life found themselves on this path. A widow who couldn't keep up with her late husband's debts. A young man who stood as a guarantor for a friend's loan, only for the friend to disappear. A merchant whose business partner cheated him. The reasons were endless, and they were often rooted in bad luck more than bad character. The fear of debt was a constant shadow. It could turn a neighbor into an enemy and a simple misfortune into a life sentence. The knock on the door from the bailiff was a sound that could mean the end of your life as you knew it. You'd be taken from your family, your work, and your home, and led to a place from which there was no certain escape. The term debtor's prison might create a single image in your mind, but the reality was varied. There wasn't one type of institution. Sometimes debtors were held in a specific section of a common jail, separated from the felons and murderers. In larger cities like London, there were famous prisons dedicated almost entirely to debtors, places like the Fleet or the Marshalsea. But no matter the name on the gate, the experience inside shared some fundamental, grim features. The first thing that would hit you was the smell. It was a mix of unwashed bodies, human waste, cheap ale, and sickness. Sanitation was a foreign concept. Toilets were often just open pits in a yard or overflowing buckets in a corner. The floors were covered in filth and straw. That was rarely changed. In this environment, disease was not a risk, it was a certainty. Lice, fleas, and rats were your constant companions. Typhus, which was spread by lice, was so common in these places it was nicknamed gall fever. An outbreak could sweep through a prison, killing dozens of prisoners in a matter of weeks. The second thing you'd notice was the noise. Prisons were not quiet places of reflection. They were crowded, chaotic, and loud. People were packed into small rooms, sometimes with dozens of others. There was no privacy. You slept on the floor, or if you were lucky, on a pile of dirty straw. The air was thick with the sounds of arguments, crying, coughing, and the occasional song from those who had found solace in drink. But the most shocking part of the system was its internal economy. You might think that once you were in prison, your expenses would be over. The opposite was true. You had to pay for everything. The moment you arrived, you were met by the jailer or warden. You had to pay an entry fee. They called it garnish. It was a fee you paid to the jailer and sometimes to the other prisoners just for the privilege of being admitted into their miserable society. If you couldn't pay, you might be stripped of your coat or shoes. Everything had a price. Did you want a bed? You had to rent it. A blanket? That cost extra. A candle to see in the dark? You had to buy it. Food and water were not provided by the state. You had to purchase them from the jailer, who often ran a tavern or shop inside the prison. The prices were, of course, inflated. The jailer had a captive market. He could charge whatever he wanted for a loaf of bread or a mug of ale. This was the central, cruel paradox of the debtor's prison. It was a place you were sent to because you had no money, and once inside, you needed money for basic survival. This created a stark, two-tiered society within the prison walls. For those who had some money, or who had friends and family on the outside willing to support them, life was bearable. They could pay for a private room, or at least a shared room with only a few others. This was known as the master's side of the prison. Here you could get better food, cleaner bedding, and even have wine delivered. You could pay for the privilege of having your spouse or family visit, or even live with you in your cell. Some wealthy debtors lived in relative comfort, recreating a pale imitation of their former lives, surrounded by their books and a few personal belongings. But for the truly poor, there was the common side. This was hell. Here, prisoners were packed into large, filthy wards. They had nothing but what they came in with. If they had no money, they relied on charity. Some prisons had official charitable bequests, small funds left by wealthy individuals in their wills to provide a daily loaf of bread for the poorest inmates. Prisoners would beg from visitors or from people passing by on the street if their cells had windows facing outwards. If the charity ran out, or if they couldn't get enough by begging, they starved. Death from malnutrition was common on the common side, so the walls of the prison did more than just separate the inside from the outside. They created a brutal, miniature version of the world where your survival depended entirely on your ability to pay. The system was not designed to reform or to punish in a structured way. It was a business. The jailer's position was often a private franchise he bought from the state. His income came from the fees he could extract from the prisoners. Their misery was his profit. Life inside a debtor's prison was not just about survival. It was about enduring a strange, suspended existence. Your old life was gone, but you weren't truly a criminal in the eyes of society. You were in limbo, and in that limbo, a new distorted society began to form with its own rules, economy, and social structure. The day-to-day reality was a strange mix of crushing boredom and constant anxiety. There was little to do. You were not put to work like in a later workhouse. Your only job was to wait. Wait for a family member to visit with a bit of food or money. Wait for news from a lawyer. Wait for your creditor to have a change of heart. The hours, days, and weeks blurred together. To pass the time, prisoners did what people do everywhere. They talked. They played games. Dice and cards were common, often leading to new debts being created inside the prison itself. They formed friendships and alliances. They also formed rivalries and factions. The microcosm of the prison had its own bullies, its own leaders, and its own victims. The strong or the clever could find ways to get by, perhaps by running errands for wealthier prisoners or by operating small-time rackets. The prison had its own internal economy that went beyond the jailer's extortion. Prisoners with skills could try to earn a little money. A cobbler might be able to mend shoes. A tailor could patch clothes. A man who could read and write might charge a small fee to write letters for his illiterate cellmates. These were tiny streams of income, rarely enough to pay off a major debt, but perhaps enough to buy a bit of extra food or a candle. A key part of this society was the connection to the outside world. The prison gate was a constantly revolving door for visitors, messengers, and suppliers. Its family was the lifeline. A wife might bring food every day. A son might bring news of the family business. These visits were a source of both comfort and pain. They were a reminder of the life you had lost and the burden you had become to your loved ones. The desperation was immense. Prisoners would beg their families to sell furniture, to borrow from neighbors, to do anything to raise the money for their release. In some of the larger, more established debtors' prisons, there was a surprising degree of freedom, but it came at a price. The concepts of the rules or the liberties existed. This was an area, a district of several streets that surrounded the prison. If a debtor could provide a significant bond, often paid to the prison's warden, they were allowed to live outside the prison walls, but within the boundaries of the rules. They could rent a room, live with their family, and even try to conduct business. But they were not free. They had to remain within the designated area. If they stepped 1 foot outside the boundary, they would be seized and thrown back into the main prison, losing the money they had paid for the privilege. This created a strange community of prisoners at large, living a semi-normal life within an invisible cage. For those stuck inside, the social hierarchy was rigid. It was based entirely on money. At the top were the wealthy debtors on the master's side. They had status. They were treated with a degree of respect by the jailers. Below them were the middling sort, those who had enough support to get by but not enough for comfort. And at the very bottom were the destitute on the common side. They were often treated as less than human, both by the jailers and by their fellow prisoners. They were the ones most likely to die of disease or starvation, their bodies unceremoniously buried in a pauper's grave. This society was held together by a fragile mix of shared misfortune and individual desperation. There could be moments of collective action. Prisoners might band together to protest a particularly cruel jailer or a sudden rise in the price of bread. But more often, it was every man for himself. The system was designed to isolate you, to make you focus only on your own debt and your own survival. It turned a community of debtors into a collection of individuals, each scrambling to find a way out, even if it was at the expense of someone else. Life inside was a constant negotiation, a daily struggle to hold on to your health, your sanity, and some small piece of your humanity. Being in a debtor's prison was like being at the bottom of a well. You could see the sky, but you had no obvious way to climb out. The sentence was indefinite, so the question that haunted every waking moment was, how do I get out? There were ways, but none of them were easy. The most straightforward path to freedom was to pay the debt. This was the entire point of the system. But it was also the great flaw in its logic. How could a person earn money while locked in a cage? For most, paying the full amount themselves was impossible. The hope lay with the outside world. Family and friends were the first and best hope. They would try to scrape together the money. They might sell off household goods, mortgage a piece of land, or borrow from their own network of contacts. This process could take months or even years. The prisoner waited, relying on letters and visits for news of their progress. Every piece of positive news was a lifeline. Every setback was crushing. The pressure on families was immense. They often impoverished themselves in the effort to free one member, sometimes leading to a domino effect where other family members then fell into debt. Charity was another possible route. The plight of the poor debtor struck a chord with many people. Some wealthy individuals, as an act of Christian piety, would leave money in their wills, specifically to pay the debts of poor prisoners. Church congregations might take up collections. Charitable societies were formed with the express purpose of visiting prisons, assessing the cases of debtors, and liberating those they deemed worthy and whose debts were small enough to be manageable. And getting help from a charity was like winning a lottery. There were always far more debtors than there was charitable money available. You had to be lucky enough to have your case heard and to be seen as a deserving poor person, not someone who got into debt through vice or foolishness. Negotiation with the creditor was another option. The creditor was the one who held the key. After a debtor had been in prison for a long time, it might become clear to the creditor that they were never going to get the full amount. A prisoner who died of gall fever would pay nothing. So, a creditor might be persuaded to accept a smaller sum, a portion of the original debt, in exchange for signing the release papers. This required a delicate dance of negotiation, often carried out by a lawyer or a family member. The creditor had all the power, but even they might eventually decide that something was better than nothing. Over time, the law began to offer a few, very narrow escape hatches. Early forms of bankruptcy law started to appear. For example, under certain acts, prisoners whose debts were below a certain amount could swear an oath that they had no hidden assets. They would have to surrender all their worldly goods to their creditors. After this, the court could order their release. These laws were often temporary and had many loopholes. Creditors could challenge the debtor's oath, claiming they were lying and hiding money, which could keep them in prison longer. But it was a glimmer of hope, an admission by the system that locking people up forever was not always a productive solution. And then there was the darkest way out, death. For many, especially those on the common side with no outside support, this was the most likely end to their story. They would succumb to starvation, malnutrition, or disease. The prison records of the time are filled with short, grim entries. Died of the fever, found dead in a cell. For these people, freedom came only in death. Their debt was canceled, and their creditor got nothing. It was the ultimate failure of a system designed to extract payment. The hope of release was what kept people going. It was a fragile thing, nurtured by letters from home, rumors of a new charitable fund, or a kind word from a visitor. But for every person who walked out the prison gates, back into the sunlight, there were many more who remained, trapped by a few shillings or a few pounds, watching their lives waste away inside the walls. The debtors' prison was a remarkably persistent institution. It lasted for centuries, spanning the medieval period well into the 19th century. Its logic, while cruel, seemed simple and sound to generations of lawmakers and creditors. If you owe money, you should pay it. If you won't pay it, we will make your life miserable until you or your family does. It was a system built on a foundation of personal responsibility, at least in theory. But over time, the deep flaws in this logic became more and more apparent. The system was not just cruel, it was profoundly inefficient and often self-defeating. Think about it. If a skilled craftsman owed a debt, what was the best way to ensure he could repay it? The answer would be to let him work. Let him use his skills to earn money and pay back what he owed. Instead, the system took that craftsman, locked him in a filthy, unproductive environment, and demanded he somehow produce money out of thin air. It was like breaking a man's legs and then getting angry at him for not being able to walk. This fundamental contradiction started to dawn on social reformers, economists, and even some politicians. They began to argue that debtors' prisons were not just morally wrong, but they were bad for the economy. Every person languishing in prison was a person not contributing to society. They were not working, not producing goods, not paying taxes. They were simply a burden. Their skills were wasting away. Their families were often forced onto public charity. Imprisoning a debtor didn't solve a financial problem. It created several new ones. The stories that came out of the prisons began to shock the public conscience. Writers and journalists started to document the horrific conditions. They wrote about the starvation on the common side, the rampant disease, and the corruption of the jailers who profited from human suffering. Famous authors wrote characters who suffered in debtors' prisons, bringing the reality of these places into the homes of the wealthy and middle classes. People began to see it not as a just system for enforcing contracts, but as a barbaric and pointless cruelty. Legal reforms began to happen, slowly and painfully. The first changes were small. The laws were passed to try and curb the worst abuses of the jailers. Other laws made it slightly easier for the poorest debtors to be released after a certain period. The idea of bankruptcy evolved. Originally a concept for merchants, it gradually expanded to include ordinary people. The principle of bankruptcy was a radical shift in thinking. It acknowledged that sometimes debts were simply unpayable. It offered a legal process to wipe the slate clean, allowing a person to start over rather than rot in a cell forever. This was a move away from punishing the debtor and towards resolving the debt in a practical way. The creditors themselves also began to realize the system wasn't always in their best interest. While the threat of prison could be a powerful tool to intimidate someone into paying, the actual imprisonment often yielded nothing. A creditor had to pay for the prisoner's upkeep, at least a very minimal amount. This meant they were throwing good money after bad. A savvy creditor might realize that it was better to negotiate a partial payment from a free man than to get nothing from a man in prison. The end of the debtor's prison was not a single event. It was a slow, gradual dismantling. Laws were passed that limited who could be imprisoned for debt and for how long. The final abolition of the practice in many countries during the 19th century was the culmination of a long struggle. It was a recognition that a person's liberty should not be a commodity that can be seized by a private individual. The legacy of the debtor's prison is a reminder of how societies have struggled with the concept of debt. It shows a time when the line between a civil dispute and a loss of fundamental human rights was almost non-existent. While we no longer lock people up in the same way for failing to pay a loan, the core issues have not disappeared. We still debate how to handle debt, both personal and national. We still struggle with the balance between a lender's right to be repaid and a borrower's right to a humane existence. The walls of the Fleet and the Marshalsea have been torn down, but the shadow they cast is long, and the questions they force us to ask about money, justice, and humanity are still with us today.